Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Only very few books force you to rethink the world as you know it. But that's absolutely true of William Dalrymple's latest work. It presents ancient and medieval India in a way that you either did not know of, or if you were dimly aware of it, you didn't fully understand. Here is the book. It's called The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. And there is William.
This is turning like a book launch, Karan. Thank you so much for being my publicist. This is the most unexpected turn of events.
Joining me now to talk about the book and what it, as you've already guessed, is the author, William Dalrymple himself. William Dalrymple, before I come to details and specifics, let me start with two very important points you make in your book. Of the period your book covers, which is roughly the 3rd century BC to the 12th, 13th century CE, you say, and I'm quoting you, what Greece was first to Rome, then to the rest of the Mediterranean and European world, so at this period, India was to Southeast and Central Asia and even to China. And then you add, the Golden Road aims to highlight India's often forgotten position as the crucial economic fulcrum and civilizational engine at the heart of the ancient and early medieval worlds. Are you saying that during this period, India was one of the dominant, if not at times perhaps the dominant, intellectual and cultural force in the world?
It's one of the major intellectual and cultural forces in the world. There are 2 or 3 places in antiquity which come up with answers to the really big questions. What are we doing here? Why are we here? How do we measure the world we're in? How do we measure time? What is the circumference of the earth? What's the distance between the earth and the sky? What are the heavens? India is one of those. Greece is another. China is a third. I think it's a hopeless game to try and sort of weigh up which one of those had more influence. And obviously there'll be, it's not like a football match where each side has to score goals and you end up with a winner and a gold cup. All 3 of those great civilizations made extraordinary contributions. But the difference, and I think this is what was one of the main drivers behind me writing this book, is that while Europeans have for 200 or 300 years extolled the importance of Greece, and while every English kid to this day knows the story about Archimedes and his bath and Eureka and Pythagoras and his theorem and pi, and while China has been spectacularly good at promoting the idea of the Silk Road, which is a very Sinocentric view of trade networks that center around obviously silk and what they call the terminus of the Silk Road, which is Chang'an. India has been much less good at promoting itself. And where you have Indians promoting India, it's often done very clumsily. You get, there's the joke in Goodness Gracious Me, the British comedy show, where Sanjeev Bhaskar's Indian uncle says, Leonardo da Vinci, Indian, Jesus Christ, Indian, the royal family, Indian. And this, I think, reflects a fact that everyone in India knows that they come from a very ancient and very great culture. But there's often been very little coherent articulation of exactly how and why India was so utterly extraordinary and how it influenced so much of the world. And I think, a lot of what I'm saying has been known for generations by millions of people. The fact that the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, but in Angkor Wat. The fact that Buddhism reached not only China, Japan, and Korea, but Siberia and Mongolia. The fact that half the world's population at one time or another lived in countries dominated by Indic philosophies or Indian religions. The fact that when you go to Bali, where I'm heading tomorrow, in fact, that there is a whole world of Hindu culture still surviving. The fact that in Buddhism, the Buddhism of Japan, the frescoes of Cambodia, in all these places, you see these traces of Indian influence. But somehow they've come to be studied in different traditions and different academic worlds. You have the Sanskritists who talk about Southeast Asia and the spread of the Ramayana there. You have the story of Buddhism, often annexed by China and told as part of the story of the Silk Road. And the story of India's extraordinary mathematics, its astronomy, and its contributions to the study of the heavens and the earth are told, if at all, in the history of science classes, but in fact are really not taught outside India. When I've been going around Britain lately with this book, even in Oxford and Cambridge, you say the names Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta and ask people to raise their hands if they know what they've done. 3 hands go up and they're all Indians. The Goras literally don't know what we're talking about.
Absolutely. But at the bottom of that answer is something that I think is particularly significant and important. And although you didn't say it in so many words, but what you're suggesting is, unlike the Europeans who blew the trumpet on behalf of Greece, unlike the Chinese who blew the trumpet for themselves, India didn't blow its own trumpet. India's achievements, India's contribution wasn't made known. As you said, it's been pretty clumsy about making it known to the world.
And where you have had Indians proclaiming the greatness of ancient India, often it's been done in a slightly wrong-headed way. For example, throughout the 1930s and 40s, there was a Greater India Society, which very much promoted the idea of what R.C. Majumdar called ancient Hindu colonies in Southeast Asia. Now, we now know that there were no ancient Hindu colonies in Southeast Asia, that Indian ideas did not spread with the sword. They spread through missionaries, they spread through merchants, through trade. And it was the remarkable feat of the sheer sophistication and brilliance of these ideas were taken up all around India. So there's, in a sense, this overstatement of Indian martial power as being the reason for this spread of Indian influence by scholars in the 1930s of the nationalist persuasion, I think led to a big pushback in academia. That particularly in Southeast Asia, the newly independent Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia didn't like to be thought of as sort of savages brought up by Brahmins. And there's been a shyness in academia in general about this process of Indianization.
Sure.
Indian historians themselves, I think there's no question that, there was a great many Marxists at work in the history departments of India, and they were more interested in social and economic forces than they were in art, culture, and religion. And so there was very little pushback on that front. And on top of all that, you have, the baleful shadow of Macaulay's Indology, the idea that the Victorian British promoted, often in contrast to the earlier figures like Sir William Jones and my own forebear James Prinsep, who were great champions of Sanskrit and ancient Indian culture. James Prinsep was my great uncle, and these characters gave way to people like Macaulay, who the Princeps incidentally took on in debate at the time. Henry Prinsep, James Prinsep's brother, had a whole series of debates.
Don't get lost in the detail. Don't get lost in the detail. You lose your audience.
Okay, I will cut to the chase. So thanks to the baleful influence of colonialism, the idea of Macaulay's Indology that a single shelf of good English books is worth all the native literature of India and Arabia. We laugh at those ideas now, but it still casts their shadows in the sense that no one in Britain or Europe or America has ever heard of Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta.
Absolutely. As you say, there are a variety of reasons why India's great intellectual and cultural contribution to the world didn't get made better known to the world. Some of those reasons are to do with Indian scholarship. Others are to do with the fact that, in fact, India didn't blow its trumpet. But let me come to the second big, broad point you make. And that is this time to do with China. China presents itself as the middle kingdom, in other words, as the center of the world. But the truth is, and you point this out in your book, that there was hardly any direct trade between China and the West during this period, whereas such was the extent of the trade between the Roman Empire and India that by one estimate, custom taxes may have generated 1/3 of the total income of the Roman exchequer. That's astonishing if it's true. And secondly, and again, I suspect this is proof of the relationship between India and the West, you say Indian museums contain more Roman coins than any country outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire. This, in a very real sense, significantly resets the India-China story during this period.
Absolutely. And I've been very angry lately. There are not one but two major exhibitions in London at the moment celebrating the Silk Roads. Both of them remarkable exhibitions, taken years to put together, have wonderful exhibits, spectacular, mounted with spectacular lavishness. But both of them completely ignore India. The first, the show at the British Museum, is called Silk Roads, and tells the story of the trade networks of Asia between 500 and 1000. And while there are odd Indian items in the displays, so a Swat Buddha, a Gandharam Buddha that was found in Sweden, the rhinestones from Rajasthan that made up the Sutton Hoo treasure that were found in England. There's no exhibit about India, while there are exhibits about various places in China and Central Asia, in Italy, in North Africa, and the Arab world, and so on. India is left out of the story. And in the British Library show, which is called the Silk Road Oasis, about the Dunhuang extraordinary manuscripts brought back to the British Library by Aurel Stein, there is a map which has east-west roads highlighted in white, and then a black space set with Indian kingdoms where India is. No cities, no roads, as if it's a darkness, a Mordor beneath.
And the point your book very forcefully makes is that during the period of the Roman Empire, India was by far the greater trade relationship with the Roman Empire. China hardly had any relationship at all.
It had no direct relationship whatsoever. You cannot point to a single successful trade mission or diplomatic mission between China and Rome. They had a vague awareness of each other's existence. In the literature of both, you have an awareness of some kingdom in the far distance that's rich and powerful. But if they ever met, they met in the ports of Gujarat, because the west coast of India was the absolute focus of Roman trade. Go back to your literature classes, Karan. Remember Antony Cleopatra? I'm sure you played somewhere, Shashi, where I remember once played Antony with Mira Nair's Cleopatra, I think I'm right in saying. But can you remember at that period, Octavius Caesar, later the Emperor Augustus, captures Egypt after the suicide of Cleopatra and Antony. And suddenly Rome has a sea border with India. Because thanks to the monsoon winds, it takes only 2 months, if you sail at the right time of year, to move from Kerala, from Muziris in Kerala, or Barigaza in Gujarat, or Babarakam at the mouth of the Indus near modern Karachi. To sail from any of those ports takes only 2 months if you have the monsoon behind you. Then you have to wait around for a few months, go and see the pyramids, shopping in Alexandria, go to a Roman circus on the Mediterranean. And then in August, the winds reverse and you can sail back again. And this is one of India's great natural gifts, that because of the Tibetan plateau freezing over at this time of year and then thawing in spring, you get this sort of bellows effect. And for half the year, the winds blow in one direction, then they reverse and they flow back again. So Indian sailors have this gift that they can go almost anywhere at great speed. Within
and this
the immediate vicinity.
The relationship between India and the Roman Empire.
Exactly.
And this also explains that very important point that you established in your book, that one estimate suggests that custom taxes on trade with India could have generated 1/3 of the total income of the Roman Empire. That alone, if it's correct, suggests the volume of the trade and the importance in terms of value of that trade.
Scholars fight over that figure, but it's only a question of whether it's a sixth, a fifth, or a third. I mean, the vague idea that a vast chunk of Roman revenues come from the Red Sea customs is not disputed by any scholar I know.
Absolutely.
And this is a new situation because of a whole series of new discoveries and a whole series of new excavations. There's excavations by a team from Chicago at the port of Berenike on the Egyptian Red Sea coast that's been producing Hindu gods, Buddhist idols, even one Indian trader's pet monkey, along with great quantities of black pepper and all the imports left by these Indian traders, even traces of their food. People have been with dhania, with coriander and rice left from some meal in the 1st and 2nd century. And at the same time, we've had P.J. Cherian here in India, working at the Maziris site outside Cochin, and finding exactly the same, but in reverse, finding Roman amphorae and Roman goods and Roman food and garum, Roman fish sauce being eaten, for example, down in Kerala.
Absolutely. As I said at the beginning, these are the two big, broad points your book makes. And I wanted to begin with those on purpose because I think it was important for the audience to understand that your book establishes how India was a dominant cultural and an intellectual force between the period 3rd century BC and the 12th, 13th century CE. And secondly, how India's relationship with the Roman Empire was considerably greater and more profound and certainly more valuable than that of China. But against that background,
if I could break in there, Karan, for 1 minute. So yes, that's a bit of the story. But what happens, this is the crucial point, which we should say also straight up, because it's the other half of this argument. Rome falls in the 5th century. Attila the Hun besieges Rome. What does he ask for as ransom, incidentally? He asks for 10,000 pounds of Indian pepper, not Chinese silk. That's what he regarded as the most valuable thing inside Rome. And after Rome falls, you have an economic crisis in India, because India has been, for 500 years nearly, India has been receiving easy money from the Roman Empire. It doesn't cost much to grow pepper in India. It costs even less to bring down an elephant with a few arrows or a spear and then sell the ivory. And the ivory trade, tons and tons of ivory heading to the Roman Empire, along with pepper, along with silk, along with cotton, along with also materials for perfumery. Malabathrum and nard are two Indian products that Romans couldn't get enough of. These were all coming in great fleets. Strabo talks about a single fleet that he saw with his own eyes of 250 ships waiting for the winds to be right to sail them to India in one Red Sea port. Now, that all ends in 500. An economic crisis takes place in southern India, and it is the Tamil trade guilds that realize they've got a major opportunity and they pivot eastwards.
Absolutely, but you're jumping ahead of the story.
Okay, I'll leave it.
Step, otherwise, you will end up confusing the audience. I deliberately brought up these two big, broad points at the start because I wanted them in the background when we come to the details. I want to come now to the three narratives that your book is in fact about. They are the spread of Buddhism to China and Central Asia, the spread of Hinduism and Sanskritik culture to Southeast Asia all the way to Cambodia and Java, and the spread of Indian concepts of mathematics and astronomy to the Arab world and thence to Europe. I'd like you to give me a potted account of each of these, but I'll get you to go through them one by one, almost in silos, so the audience can easily understand, and start with the spread of Buddhism from India to China and Central Asia?
Well, it starts with obviously the Buddha. The Buddha is a historical character, did live in the mid-5th century BCE, but there's very little evidence that Buddhism spread much outside the area that the Buddha preached in. In other words, sort of Bihar and UP, Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, and Sarnath for the first few hundred years. And it's only with the Emperor Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism in 250 BCE, around that time, that you get these extraordinary missions. Ashoka says in his Kandahar inscription, he sent Dharma ministers to preach the Buddha's word as far as Cyrene, which is Libya. So you can see these guys going out over vast areas. We have inscriptions in Anatolia that seem to echo in Greece some of the language of Ashoka, implying that Ashoka's words did take root in some form in some places. But it is obviously first of all, the big success of his mission was spreading Buddhism into southern India, into the Deccan, and then particularly to Sri Lanka. And we have the story of how Mahinda, the son of Sri Lanka, the son of the king of Sri Lanka, converts to Buddhism. I'll start again. We have the story of how Mahinda, the son of Ashoka, is sent to Anuradhapura, where he converts the king of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka becomes a major center of the Buddhist mission itself. You have these monasteries like Abhayagiri, which sort of franchise themselves and set up in Java and elsewhere. And from that period, Buddhism is an export. And the great period when it spreads over the Pamirs into what's now Western China is with the Kushans. The Kushans, who are nomads that come from Western China, they sweep down from China into India as far as Mathura and the Yamuna and the beginning of the Gangetic Plain. And this opens up, means a single kingdom straddling the Himalayas and the Pamirs. And this allows Buddhist missionaries to cross, in a sense, the opposite direction, exactly the direction that the Kushan armies have just come, into Western China. And you get characters like Kumarajiva, who's a fascinating character, little talked about in India, but who was the son of an Indian Brahmin who'd married a Kutcha princess from what's now Xinjiang, from what's now Uyghur territory. And he's the first translator of between Sanskrit and Chinese. And he does wonderful translations, which were very free, but which later purists such as Xuanzang, the famous Buddhist monk from Western China who goes to visit Nalanda, he thinks that these texts have been corrupted. So he wants to go back to the source. And Xuanzang in the 7th century AD starts his famous pilgrimage to the great Mahavihara, or university monastery of Nalanda in Bihar. And there he spends 20 years copying out texts, not just of Buddhist Yogacara, which was his main interest, but also, it seems, mathematics and all sorts of other subjects, although Buddhism was his central interest. And he heads back over the Himalayas to China, where the Emperor Taizong, who's the new Tang Emperor, builds the Wild Goose Pagoda, this wonderful library which still stands in the center of what's now called Xi'an. You see this gradual growth in the influence of Buddhism. It becomes a major force at court. And it is a pupil of Xuanzang, most improbable pupil, a woman called Wu Zetian. And Wu is a 5th ranking concubine when we first meet her. Xuanzang is an old monk by this time in his 60s, but he somehow makes common cause with this Buddhist concubine. She is a piece of work. She not only manages to seduce the emperor's son, the crown prince, she has a child, which is then found murdered in mysterious circumstances. It looks like Wu has framed the empress and the chief concubine and has them dispatched. They're judicially murdered. Their bones are broken. One of them is accused of witchcraft, the other of murder. They're drowned in a vat of wine. Wu herself becomes empress. Then the emperor dies. And for the only time in Chinese dynastic history, a woman becomes the emperor. And she does this by getting rid of the Confucians, who don't allow women to rule, getting rid of the Taoists, and having effectively a coup d'etat in the heart of imperial China by Nalanda-trained Buddhist monks, by Xuanzang's cohort of Indian-trained Buddhist monks. They all say that she's the reincarnation.
Did she end up with a sort of Indian darbar around her in China?
Many of the monks from Nalanda were, in fact, ethnic Chinese. But yes, there was figures with names. For example, the chief astronomer in her court was called Siddhartha Gautama. You can't get more sort of UP than that. You have effectively a Mahayana Buddhist coup d'etat. And for the rest of her reign, which is a further 40 years, this is the high tide moment of Indian influence in China, when Indian astronomy, Indian mathematics, many other Indian sciences and Indian influence are at their peak. There's a slow diminution from that point. And you could say, in a sense, that now is one of the lower points, I think, between India and Chinese relations.
But this is an aspect of the relationship between India and China that isn't very well known at all.
So, I mean, there are scholars.
Wu Zetian is unknown in our country.
Well, there are great Indian scholars who've worked on her, and I'd particularly like to call out here Tanzan Sen, who's a fantastic Indian-born scholar working in China with NYU Shanghai, who's done a huge amount of work, which I used to tell the story. Without his work, half of this would not be known. But you're right, it's not widely known. She is widely known in China, where there's been a sort of 250-part soap opera, which is rather like in the 1980s, the Doordarshan Mahabharat, which had half the nation watching it. It's a bit like that. But the Indian nature of her coterie, I think, is not played up in that. She's just seen as this sort of sexy Lady Macbeth figure, busy sort of getting rid of chief ministers and rivals.
Let's at this point come to the second narrative, which is also a commanding narrative in your book. It's the spread of Indian mathematical and astronomical concepts to
You're
the
missing
Arab world.
the Southeast Asian bit.
Sorry, say it again?
You're missing the Southeast Asian bit here, Karan.
I'll come to that afterwards.
Okay.
Let's come to the spread of Indian mathematical and astronomical concepts to the Arab world and then onwards to Europe. There were the ideas here of Aryabhat and Brahmagupta. You mentioned those two people earlier. Those are names that are known. But what is it about their concepts that was so special and unique? Can you begin by explaining that to the audience?
So there's a very, very ancient mathematical tradition in India that obviously goes back to the Vedas. In order to do your Vedic sacrifices at the most auspicious times, you had to understand the movement of the stars, and you had to be able to calculate the correct way of doing the sacrifices in association with the heavens. So there's a lot of concern in the Vedas about understanding how the stars move and the mathematics of that is there from the beginning. But the golden age of Indian mathematics is much later. It's in the 5th and 6th century CE. And I think it's very important. Sometimes when nationalists tell their version of Indian history, you get the idea that sort of ancient India is some hermetically sealed casket where Indian genius flourishes without any outside influence. That's not my impression. I have much more of an idea from what I've read that like today, if you want to make a great scientific advance, you read all the material around you and then you take it forward. That seems to be the case in the 5th and 6th century too. You have the scholars like Aryabhatta who have read the Vedic mathematics, but they've also read what they call the Yavana Sutras, which are Greek texts. There's some hints of the influence of ancient Babylon, where a version of zero it first appears as a placeholder, ancient Persian mathematics and astronomy. And what happens in the 5th and 6th century is that Aryabhatta takes all this and you have him calculating, for example, the distance between the Earth and the Moon, the circumference of the Earth, the fact that the Earth pivots on its own axis. These are all discoveries of Aryabhatta. Then a generation later, you have Brahmagupta, who's based, of all places, in Mount Abu in Rajasthan. He takes forward the idea of zero, which is implicit in a lot of earlier Indian work, and it's also there in Babylon. But he defines it for the first time. And so he comes up with a set of rules of how exactly zero is a number, not just an absence, not just a placeholder, but it's a number with its own rules. For example, it's the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. He comes up with 20 or 30 of those rules and defines zero and allows, therefore, zero to gain a power as to use zero in decimal places, tens, hundreds, thousands, to augment the existing Indian number system, which had a 1 to 9, and then he adds the 0. And this is the idea which travels around the world. And the first stage of it is when in 773, a delegation from Sind arrives in the great Arab capital of Abbasid Baghdad, carrying a book that the Arabs call the Great Sind Hind. Now, it seems to be a compilation of the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. It's translated initially by a slightly clumsy Arab astronomer called Al-Fazari, and it's only a few generations later that a young man appears from Khiva, which the Persians call that area Khwarazm. So the guy is known as Al-Khwarizmi, the guy from Khwarazm. He comes to Baghdad and finds all the texts. There's a remarkable lineage of viziers in Baghdad called the Barmakids, a family who had originally been Buddhist monks and Buddhist abbots in Afghanistan. This family have gathered all this Indic material in the libraries of Baghdad, and it's Al-Khwarizmi who gathers it all together and writes a new book, which isn't full of the complexity that you get in Aryabhatta and in Brahmagupta, both of whom incidentally write in rhyming poetry. This is clear Arab prose that even a child can understand. And so successful is this book that it spreads around the Islamic world. That book has a long, sort of clumsy, great title. I have to read it out to you. It's called one second. It is called The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now, that's obviously not a very snappy title. So people knew it by its nickname as simply Al-Jabr, which is the basis of our word algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi, his name itself, became the basis of our word algorithm. And this spreads right.
I mean, the joy of your book, and I'll point this out to the audience, is that it's full of some of the most fantastical stories about people. And it's people with characters that are larger than life and impossible to forget. You mentioned the Barmak family, who were the traditional viziers of Baghdad, who did a tremendous amount to actually further push into Europe eventually, but first into Arabic and then towards Europe, Indian mathematics. And then there's that amazing Italian mathematician, Fibonacci. Tell us a little about these people, because they leap to life when we read your book.
So, this great renaissance in mathematics takes place in India in the 5th, 6th century. It arrives in Baghdad 773. By the early 9th century, Al-Khwarizmi has translated it in a form that's instantly accessible to any clever young man or woman. And it passes right across the Arab world, right up to Spain, to the borders of Christian Europe. And Christian Europe, however, although there's a few scholars who do come down to the area around Barcelona, there's a monastery called Ripoll outside Barcelona, where you have some evidence of this Indian figures, the nine figures of the Indias, as they're known, plus 0, being explored and looked at by clever monks. Otherwise, though, the whole of Europe is still on Roman numbers, MCV, XV1, those great sort of things you see in inscriptions in Roman forums and so on. So it's only in the 12th century that this ceases, and it's an extraordinary story how it happens. Pisa opens a trading post on the Algerian coast, and they send a notary to write down all their investments and their trade. The guy brings his son because he's going to be away a long time. And the son goes to the local Arab school, where he picks up not just Arabic, but Arab mathematics, which is then taught as a matter of course to any clever young chap across the Arab world.
And that's Hindu mathematics. That is Aryabhata.
And that is what Aryabhata, and it's come, the relay race through Khwarizmi, it's reached Algeria. Fibonacci learns it, and incidentally, there's no sensation that the Indian origins have been forgotten. Today we call it Arabic numbers because we got it from the Arabs, but at the time, Fibonacci very clearly calls it the modus Indorum, the Indian method of calculating, and he calls it the 9 figures of the Indias plus 0. So both Al-Khwarizmi and Fibonacci acknowledge its Indian origin, and he goes back to Pisa, where he finds his friends, still trying to do long multiplication with MV, XV1. He writes a book called the Liber Abaci, which has all this in it. It reaches the ears of Frederick II, the emperor. Frederick II comes to visit Pisa and calls Fibonacci to him. And they have this sort of mathematical contest where all the court mathematicians show off their fancy tricks. And of course, Fibonacci wipes the floor with him because he's Fibonacci. And at that point, there's, I'm glad to say, a Scotsman who enters the story. And Michael Scott, who's the court astrologer of Frederick II, sort of taps Fibonacci on the back and says, look, this is all very well, young man, but it's a wee bit theoretical. You've got to be a bit more practical. He's a well-established Scottish character, Fibonacci. Sorry, Michael Scott. I'll say it again. He's a well-established Scottish character, Michael Scott. And so Fibonacci goes off and writes a second edition of the Liber Abaci, but this time it has money lending, interest rates, weights and measures, currency conversion, double accounting, all the practical things that you're going to need if you're a merchant or a banker. And this book goes round Italy like wildfire. Its products are, for example, the Medici banking dynasty. And then you get this extraordinary moment when the Renaissance painters get onto it. Piero della Francesca reads Fibonacci and writes 3 mathematical treatises. He has a friend who takes all this work to Milan, and the friend shares it with his flatmate. The flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci. So all these Indian ideas, it's like a long relay race. The baton gets passed from hand to hand. But at this point, everyone is acknowledging that the origin is India. It's only much later in the colonial period that people forget what they owe to India.
Let me at this point read something, and it's in your book, that the Chief Justice of Toledo wrote about India in 1068. And for the audience, I'll point out that was around the time William the Conqueror was setting foot on English soil for the first time. And this is what the Chief Justice of Toledo wrote. Over many centuries, all the kings of the past have recognized the ability of the Indians in all the branches of knowledge. The Indians are the essence of wisdom. The Indians have made great strides in the study of numbers and geometry. They have surpassed all other peoples in their knowledge of medical science. Tell me, how common was that view at the time? Or is the Chief Justice of Toledo almost unique in coming to this opinion?
The Chief Justice of Toledo is unique in that he's writing an intellectual history, and that's not a common, you don't often get people writing intellectual histories even today. And so he's certainly not a usual character. But there's certainly an awareness in the Arab world that these numbers come from India, that Indians are good at numbers and good at maths. It's also an awareness that the game of chess, which has become very popular in the Arab world, has an Indian origin, even though it's come through Persia. And many of the pieces are known by their Persian names. So rook is the same word that, as in Shah Rukh Khan. It means the chariot is the original meaning of rook. And when we say checkmate in chess, we're saying Shahmat, which is the king is dead. So the Persian names have been added to the Indian chessboard. But people know that India has this talent. And we have, for example, somebody called Bishop Sebokht, who is from the Syrian church, writing, I think, in the 7th century, who more or less says the same as what the Qazi of Toledo says, that Indians have this extraordinary facility for mathematics. So it's not unique. I mean, I don't think you often have people saying this sort of thing, but there are enough to make it clear that India did have this reputation over a wide area.
Finally, let's come to the third big narrative in your book. It's the spread of Hinduism and Sanskritik culture to Southeast Asia. And the fascinating thing is that it wasn't done by conquering armies setting out from the Indian subcontinent. It was done by traveling Brahmins who perhaps were missionaries, and later it was done by merchants and traders. In other words, it was a very peaceful infusion of Indian influence, not a sword or on a spear.
Correct. And I think this is where, the Indian nationalist historians of the 30s got it wrong. They were living in a colonial period, and they saw this Indian influence as part of a similar movement in antiquity. But there's no evidence to support that. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, that it is the Brahmins are going and offering them their services in Southeast Asian courts and being sought after for their administrative abilities and their way that they could take a local strongman, connect him with Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva, and suddenly, the local chieftain, let's call him Kodongula, which is the one title we get on one inscription, he suddenly becomes Surya Varman or Mahendra Varman. The whole world becomes Sanskritic. And you see the landscape begin to get renamed. You have the extraordinary way that you have a new Kurukshetra turns up in Laos. There's a new Ayodhya outside what's now Bangkok. Even the Mekong, according to some accounts, the derivation of Mekong means Ma Ganga. That's a disputed derivation, but it's perfectly plausible. So you get these ideas spreading all over Southeast Asia, and there is a significant influx of Indian DNA at this period. DNA studies show that you get various haplop groups that are specific to, for example, the Irulas of Tamil Nadu turning up in the Mekong Delta at this time. There's been a lot of work on DNA analysis of bones and things, which I footnote in the book. And so you've got large numbers of Indians turning up. And what drives them eastwards is the fact that the gold, as I said earlier, has ceased to arrive from the Roman world. The Tamil trading guilds, who are quite badass guys, these guys have their own mercenary armies, like the East India Company. They even have a corps of assassins to get rid of anyone who bumps off one of their members. And these guys found new settlements and developed trading outposts in the Mekong Delta, in Java, all over Sumatra and so on. And they're looking very largely for gold. So you find Tamil touchstone near the gold mines in Takua Pa in Thailand. You find Indian sources renaming Sarawak as Savanadvipa, the land of gold. In the Ramayana, Sugriva tells Hanuman, if you kick the dust kick the ground in Savanadvipa, gold will fly in the air. So you get the impression from Buddhist Jataka tales, from the epics and so on, that suddenly there's a lot of Indian activity directed at Southeast Asia, a lot of trade. And then first you get some early Buddhist images, wooden Buddhist images turning up in the Mekong Delta. Then you get small handheld images of Vishnu. Then you get much larger Shiva lingams and huge statues of Vishnu in various incarnations. And finally, you get the growth of Hindu temples. Some of them, like, for example, the one in Gedong Songo in Java, very closely modeled, apparently, on the Shore temple in Mamallapuram. So it's particularly Pallava architecture. And it's also the Pallava Grantha script, which is the southern form of Brahmi, that spreads through Southeast Asia. The Pallava Brahmi is the basis for every single Southeast Asian script, Lao, Pew, Thai, Mon, and so on, right up until the Islamic period, when you get a few Islamic scripts turning up too.
And you also get Angkor Wat, as you pointed out earlier, the biggest Hindu temple anywhere in the world, but quite a fantastic creation, because it has friezes of depictions from the Ramayana, and I gather the Mahabharata as well.
Exactly. I mean, you go there, and it isn't just Angkor Wat, incidentally. It's also, for example, Borobudur, which is the largest Buddhist complex in the world. And what's interesting is that today we have a united India, and Southeast Asia is fragmented into Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. The opposite was true in the 12th century, that you had an India which was divided into many different kingdoms with the Pallavas, the Cholas, the Chalukyas, and so on. While in Southeast Asia, you had a massive Khmer Empire, which certainly has many people would say that was the largest and most powerful Hindu empire ever. Was actually the Khmer Empire. And they, along with the Srivijaya Empire, which is the most powerful Buddhist empire of the period, are two mega states that are capable of building, in the case of Srivijaya, Borobudur, and in the case of the Khmer, Angkor Wat, 4 times the size of the Vatican City. A Vishnu temple conceived in the 12th century by Suryavarman II, and filled, as you say, with images of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Battle of Lanka, the Kurukshetra, Krishna and the Gopis, all these stories that were first told on the banks of the Ganges or the banks of the Yamuna, born again in stone on the banks of the Mekong.
But the amazing thing, William Dalrymple, is that Hinduism and Sanskritik culture spread through the Khmer Empire, but India's caste system never took root there. How do you explain that?
Well, this is a very important point, and again, something that, in a sense, wasn't, I think, taken on by the early nationalist historians in the 30s and 40s. The form of Hinduism that you get in Southeast Asia is sort of oddly unfamiliar. For example, there are women Brahmins officiating in royal Khmer temples. We have that in inscriptions. We know everyone ate pork. In fact, in Angkor Thom, just the other side of Angkor Wat, there's a large picture of pigs being boiled for a feast. And you can see the pigs being popped into the cauldrons in many cases in this frieze. And you get a whole lot of unfamiliar things. For example, Jayavarman II, who's the founder of the Khmer Empire, he has himself depicted as Vishnu. Now, I don't think you've ever seen that in India. You see Rajaraja Chola with Lord Shiva, but you don't see Rajaraja Chola as Lord Shiva. But not only does Jayavarman depict himself with a discus and a conch, he also has his girlfriend or his consort or his wife depicted as Durga. So you get a whole variety of to an Indian eye, very odd Hindu developments going on, which is why when Tagore goes to Angkor Wat, he has this lovely phrase, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her.
Absolutely.
That's it. It's Hinduism, but it's not the Hinduism that we know here. It's a slightly different set of varieties of Hinduism. Equally, when you go to Bali today, as I say, I'm going to go there tomorrow, you see different Hinduisms there too, and with strange variants that are sometimes very attractive.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
At this point, let me come to the title of your book. And once again, I'll hold it up for the audience to see. It's called The Golden Road.
I should be sending you a large check, Karan, at this point.
Please don't forget to do that. The royalties of this book will enable you to be very generous. Now, as you said yourself earlier in this interview, the Golden Road that you refer to is not in fact a road. It's certainly not the Silk Road. It's in fact sea lanes which powerful monsoon winds made possible for Indian seafarers to traverse either westwards to Arabia or eastwards to Thailand and Cambodia and even on to places like Java. This is really what lay at the heart of what you call the Indosphere. The fact that India was able to set sail westwards and eastwards, carrying its concepts, carrying its culture, and often carrying its mythology.
Absolutely right. And I think it's a long overdue coinage, because we've had no phrase, in a sense, to encapsulate the whole amplitude of the diffusion of Indian culture. The Silk Road is such a neat idea. You know, it conjures up camels crossing sand dunes, the Pamirs. It's a very attractive, globalized idea that has, you know, this magical power to make people come to exhibitions and read books. There's no similar concept which has brought people to read Indian history at this period. And I very much hope people will read this book and will see sides to India that certainly in the West is unknown. And in India, though many people will recognize and know some of the periods and some of the stories, I think there's a great deal that will surprise most people.
Now, we're coming to the end of this interview, but there are two questions I simply can't resist asking you.
Please do, Karan.
First, because a lot of the audience is likely to be graduates of Oxbridge, your book suggests that Nalanda is the concept on which universities like the Sorbonne, more importantly for us, Oxford and Cambridge with their secluded quads and courts, is based upon. Is that right? Nalanda lies at the heart of that concept.
So it's a contentious idea. It's absolutely not proven. But when you go to Nalanda, what do you have? You have a courtyard, a cloister garth, where the walkways around the courtyard, and the scholars' rooms and 2 stories leading off them. That idea passes, you can see it happening in Afghanistan at the beginning of the Muslim era. In places like Lashkar Gah, you see the first madrasas coming on that plan, just copied from the neighboring Buddhist viharas. And the Islamic madrasa plan passes through Persia, through North Africa, and reaches Spain by the 8th and 9th centuries. And it's on the borders of Islamic Spain that so much of the beginning of Christian, the 12th century Renaissance begins. You will find a lot of the ideas of Arab love poetry finding their way into Dante. You find a lot of the ideas of Islamic art finding themselves in their way into Romanesque. And in this particular sphere, I think it's very clear that you see the plan of a university copying the madrasa, which in turn copies the vihara. There's a whole book written on this called Warrior of the Cloisters by a scholar in America, in California, called Christopher Baumer. And I think, it's contentious. People will argue about this, but it's certainly a case that can be made.
And it's one that Ferdinand Blount, when he reviewed your book, has bought lock, stock and barrel.
I'm very glad he did.
Now, finally, some of the interviews you've done and some of the reviews of your book have claimed that your writing supports and takes further Modi's Hindutva theory, that ancient India was a wish for Guru and this golden period ended with the arrival of Islam in India in the 12th century and 13th century. Indeed, some people have even privately suggested that for this reason, the timing of your book is unfortunate. How do you respond to that sort of viewpoint?
Well, there's a number of different answers to that. First of all, seems to be this sort of weird idea in India that if you write about the Mughals, you're somehow a Marxist. And if you write about the early ancient India, you're somehow a card-carrying member of the RSS. I'm a centrist Scot. I don't subscribe to either persuasions. I've never subscribed to Marxism. I certainly haven't ever subscribed to or become a member of the RSS, and I don't intend to. I'm interested in both these periods. I've been writing about Buddhist and Hindu art in the New York Review of Books for 40 years now. I'm a regular contributor to MARG on Buddhist murals and subjects like that. But my big academic project for the last 20 years has been the relationship between the East India Company and the late Mughals. And my company quartet has been the thing that's kept me busy since 1999. I finished it in 2019. The fourth volume, The Anarchy, was published. It's now available in a box set. So my kid said, about time you're writing about something else, Dad. You've been boring on about the Mughals and the East India Company for 20 years, and you've written 4 books that are perilously like each other. So they said, time to do something else. And so I went back to my old interest. When I was a kid, I used to dig on archaeological digs. When I first came to India, the first places I went to were Ajanta, Ellora, and Tanjore. The early India and the early classical world and the early prehistory was my great love. In fact, I didn't want to come to India at all. I tried initially to come to Iraq and dig on a site in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein closed the British School of Archaeology just before I got there, claiming it was a nest of British spies, which it probably was for all I knew. And my life would have been quite different if I'd gone to the Middle East. So no, I've been interested in this stuff for a very long time. There is a lot of truth in the fact that India was a teacher to a lot of the world. And the fact that one political persuasion or another says that doesn't make it any more right or more wrong. I think this is something you can demonstrate. It's very clear that Buddhism starts in India and ends up in Siberia and Mongolia. It's very clear that the great Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are greatly loved in Southeast Asia. And it's unequivocally true that the Indian number system and 0 is the nearest thing the human race has to a universal language. That's a fact. We all use the Indian number system. So I'm not a particular fan of the current government. I'm a centrist, and so I'm not an Indian nationalist. But this seems to me self-evidently a fascinating period of history, an extraordinary story, and one that I think hasn't been told in its completeness. What has happened is that bits of this story have been told in different disciplines. The Sanskritists have told one bit of it. The Buddhists have told another bit. The historians of science and mathematics have told another. Very little of it is brand new, but I think it's not since maybe A.L. Basham wrote The Wonder That Was India in 1954 that someone has come and sort of tried to tell it all as one story. And it's a great story. I had the most stimulating 5 years since lockdown in 2019 when The Anarchy was finished. Traveling around Southeast Asia, visiting Java and Cambodia. I'm off there again this week. It's a place I love. It's a place which I've found huge inspiration, and
But what you're
I'm very
also,
happy to tell the story. I
but
don't
what
feel
you're
any
also
embarrassment
saying,
about doing it.
But what you're also saying, and this is, I think, the important point you're making, the fact that in some way your book might support the claim made by Modi that India is or was a Vishwaguru is both coincidental and irrelevant. The story is true. It doesn't matter which politician seeks to exploit it in which way. You're simply telling a story that hasn't been told in its entirety and in its completeness before.
And I think also there is a sense that when Indians want to express their frustration that India has this extraordinary past that foreigners don't know about and has this extraordinary deep civilization, it often gets expressed clumsily with sort of talk of atomic weapons in the Mahabharata or flying saucers in the Ramayana or rishi-powered internet. I think there is a need for an accessible, clear book that lays this all down in simple statements of clear fact. A quarter of this book is the footnotes, because I know the way that people in this country often feel that historians don't back up their evidence. So I've given enough references and a long enough bibliography to keep any critical scholar busy for many years. So I think I can stand by any statement in this book. I was
But you're
very lucky,
making another
incidentally.
very important point. You're saying the claim, which is a ridiculous claim, that we had aeroplanes in the Mahabharata, or we had the internet in the Ramayana, or that there was television in the Ramayana is ridiculous. But what is true and what is brought home by this book is that the spread of Buddhism all the way to Siberia and Mongolia began and centered around India. The mathematical numerals, the great inventions and thinking of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta began in India, as did the spread of Hinduism and Sanskritik culture to Southeast Asia. That also diffused itself outwards from India, and that's the story that you're putting together. It may have been told in bits and bobs earlier, but you're putting it together for easy access in one volume.
As I said, Karan, I shall be sending you a very large check in the post and turning you into my chief publicist for my next book. Thank you very much.
I look forward to that enormously, and I want to thank you for the time. I hope that the book, once again, it's a fascinating book. And the nicest part of it is that you tell your history with a lot of biography and scintillating detail about people. The people that you're talking about, whether it's the Barmak family or Fibonacci, literally leap out of the pages and grab the reader's attention. And that's what makes the book a page turner. Thank you very much for joining me.
Karan, thank you so very much. And thank you for the close reading. It's often people pick up a book 5 minutes before doing an interview and skim the introduction, but it's clear you've read this very thoroughly. So I'm very flattered. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.